Hey everyone! This is a quick reminder to subscribe and hit that like button. It lets me know that you are enjoying my content. Also, feel free to drop your suggestions for future stories in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and let's dive right in. The Grand Azure Hotel shimmered, not in the way a newly constructed building might, all glass and steel reflecting the sun. No, the Grand Azure shimmered with an almost otherworldly luminescence. A subtle gleam that hinted at the secrets held within its aged, elegant walls. It was my first day, and I, Juliana, was the newest addition to its front desk staff. I'd landed the job after a grueling series of interviews, each one more intense than the last. They weren't just looking for someone who could handle reservations and guest inquiries. They wanted someone discreet. Someone who could blend into the background, observe without judgment, and most importantly, follow the rules. My uniform felt crisp and new, the deep navy a stark contrast to the opulent gold and crimson of the lobby. Chandeliers, each a masterpiece of intricate design, dripped from the high ceilings, casting a warm, inviting glow on the polished marble floors. The air hummed with quiet sophistication, a symphony of hushed conversations, the clinking of champagne glasses from the adjacent bar, and the almost silent glide of the impeccably dressed staff. It was a world away from my small, cluttered apartment and the endless stream of bills that seemed to multiply overnight. This job, this place, was my chance. A chance to escape, to build a better life. Mr. Thorne, the hotel manager, was a study in controlled elegance. His tailored suit fit him perfectly, his dark hair was impeccably groomed, and his demeanor was one of quiet authority. He greeted me with a polite, almost perfunctory smile, his eyes assessing me quickly before moving on. "Juliana, welcome," he said, his voice smooth and professional. "I trust your journey here was uneventful?" "Yes, sir," I replied, trying to project an air of confidence I didn't quite feel. "No problems at all." "Excellent. Then let's begin." He led me behind the long, polished mahogany counter, explaining the intricacies of the hotel's reservation system, the guest profiles, the various amenities. He spoke of the Grand Azure's commitment to impeccable service, its dedication to ensuring every guest's stay was nothing short of perfect. He emphasized the importance of discretion, of maintaining the privacy of their clientele. "Our guests," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "are accustomed to a certain level of confidentiality." I nodded, absorbing the information, trying to memorize the procedures, the codes, the subtle nuances of the system. It was a lot to take in, but I was determined to succeed. This job was more than just a paycheck. It was a lifeline. As Mr. Thorne walked me through the system, he pointed out various features, explaining how to handle different situations, from booking requests to complaints. Then, his voice changed slightly, a hint of something I couldn't quite decipher creeping into his tone. He pointed to a specific room on the screen, a room that was perpetually blocked out, its status marked as reserved for months in advance. "Room 216, he said, his gaze fixed on the screen. This room is different." I frowned slightly, confused. "Different how, sir?" He hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering away from mine before returning to the screen. "It's a long-standing policy," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Never check who reserved room 216 and never enter it." "Never?" I repeated, surprised. "Never," he confirmed, his tone firm, leaving no room for argument. "It's a matter of guest privacy. A very particular guest." He didn't elaborate, he didn't explain why this particular guest required such absolute discretion. He simply repeated the rule, his voice laced with an unspoken warning. "Never check, never enter. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," I replied, though my curiosity was burning. Who was this mysterious guest who commanded such unwavering privacy? What secrets lay hidden behind the closed door of room 216? Mr. Thorne moved on, continuing the training session, but the image of room 216, perpetually reserved, perpetually shrouded in mystery, remained etched in my mind. The way he had spoken, the slight tremor in his voice, the way he avoided eye contact, it all hinted at something more, something darker, lurking beneath the surface of the Grand Azure's polished facade. The rest of the training passed without incident. Mr. Thorne explained the procedures for handling late-night check-ins, dealing with guest requests, and managing any emergencies that might arise. He stressed the importance of remaining calm and professional, no matter the situation. He emphasized the Grand Azure's reputation for excellence, its commitment to providing an unparalleled experience for every guest. As the day drew to a close, Mr. Thorne gave me one last look, his eyes lingering on mine for a moment longer than necessary. "Remember what I said about room 216, Juliana?" he said, his voice low and serious. "It's crucial that you follow that rule, no exceptions." "I understand, sir," I replied, though a shiver ran down my spine. He nodded curtly and then turned, disappearing through a door marked "Management Only." I was left alone behind the front desk, the quiet hum of the hotel settling around me. The lobby seemed to have grown darker, the shadows lengthening, the chandeliers casting long, eerie patterns on the floor. I glanced at the computer screen, the reservation chart glowing softly in the dim light. Room 216 was still there, blocked out, a silent, ominous presence. My first solo night shift. The Grand Azure was quiet now, most of the guests tucked away in their luxurious rooms. The only sounds were the gentle murmur of the air conditioning and the occasional distant hum of an elevator. I tried to focus on my tasks, organizing paperwork, checking the reservation system, but my mind kept drifting back to room 216. The mystery surrounding it was like a persistent itch, a nagging question that refused to be ignored. I told myself it was just nerves, first-day jitters, but deep down, I knew there was something more to it, something unsettling about the way Mr. Thorne had spoken, the way he had avoided my gaze. It was as if he was afraid of something connected to that room. The silence of the Grand Azure was a living thing. It pressed in on me, a heavy blanket woven from hushed whispers and unseen shadows. Hours had passed since Mr. Thorne left, and the quiet, which had initially seemed peaceful, had morphed into something unsettling. Every creak of the old building, every distant hum of the ventilation system, sounded amplified, as if the hotel itself was holding its breath. I tried to distract myself, meticulously organizing the guest registration forms, double-checking reservations, anything to keep my mind occupied. But the image of room 216, a dark void on the brightly lit reservation chart, kept flickering in my peripheral vision. I glanced at the clock. 2:17 a.m. The witching hour, or so the cliché went. I scoffed internally. Superstitions were for tourists, not for a level-headed front desk clerk like myself. Still, a shiver traced its path down my spine. I told myself it was just the air conditioning, the cool draft that seemed to emanate from the hallway leading to the infamous room. Suddenly, the lights flickered, a brief, almost imperceptible dip in the otherwise steady illumination of the lobby. I frowned. Probably just a power surge, I thought. These old buildings were prone to them. I reached for the phone to call maintenance, but before I could dial, the reservation system on my computer went haywire. The screen flashed erratically, displaying a jumble of letters and symbols, before settling on a stark white background. Then, slowly, almost mockingly, the word "system error" appeared in bold red letters. My heart pounded in my chest. I tried to reboot the system, but the computer was unresponsive. It was as if it was frozen, trapped in some digital purgatory. And then I saw it. Room 216. The reserved status had vanished. The room was now listed as available. My breath hitched. This couldn't be happening. I knew the rule, the one rule I couldn't break. Never check, never enter. But the system had made a mistake. A big one. I frantically tried to rebook the room, to reinstate its reserved status, but the system wouldn't allow it. It was as if an invisible force was preventing me from doing so. The cursor blinked mockingly on the screen, refusing to obey my commands. I felt a cold dread creeping into my bones. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Just as I was wrestling with the malfunctioning system, the heavy oak doors of the hotel lobby swung open. A figure stumbled in, disheveled and trembling. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Petrov. She was covered in grime, her uniform ripped and stained with what looked suspiciously like blood. Her eyes were wide with terror, her face pale and contorted in a mask of pure horror. She staggered towards the front desk, gasping for breath, her hands shaking uncontrollably. There are dead people in there," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "In room 216, dead, and something else." I rushed around the counter, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mrs. Petrov, what happened? What did you see?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, professional. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone in her state. "The room, it was open." she stammered, her eyes darting around the lobby as if she expected something to jump out at any moment. I was just doing my rounds, and the door, it was open. I went inside, and she trailed off, unable to speak, her body convulsing with sobs. I tried to calm her, to reassure her, but her terror was contagious. It seeped into me, a chilling premonition of something unspeakable. Dead people, she repeated, her voice a broken whisper. And, it wasn't natural, it wasn't human. I helped her to a chair in the lobby, offering her a glass of water. She drank it down in large gulps, her hands still trembling. I noticed a deep scratch on her arm, partially hidden beneath her torn sleeve. It looked unnatural, too deep, too jagged. "Mrs. Petrov," I said gently, "can you tell me what you saw? What was in the room?" She shook her head, her eyes filled with a primal fear that transcended words. "I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't talk about it. It's too horrible." "But you have to tell me," I insisted, my voice laced with urgency. "It's important. The guests, their safety." She looked at me, her eyes pleading. "Please," she begged. Just don't go in there. Don't go near that room. Promise me." I hesitated. The rule, Mr. Thorne's warning, echoed in my mind. Never enter. But Mrs. Petrov's terror, her genuine, visceral fear, was more compelling than any rule. Something terrible had happened in room 216. Something that had shaken this seasoned housekeeper to her core. And I had a feeling that whatever it was, it wasn't finished yet. Before I could respond, the elevator doors at the far end of the lobby chimed open. My blood ran cold. A figure stepped out. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his face handsome, almost unnervingly so. He exuded an air of quiet power, of controlled elegance, but there was something else, something that sent a shiver of dread down my spine. His eyes, though they held a hint of a smile, were cold, predatory. He walked towards the front desk, his footsteps silent on the marble floor. He moved with a grace that was almost feline, his movements fluid and effortless. As he drew closer, I noticed that his features, while undeniably attractive, seemed too perfect, too symmetrical, almost artificial. He stopped in front of the desk, his gaze fixed on me. "Room 216, he said, his voice smooth, resonant. "I believe there's been a complication with my reservation." His words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken threat. "Room 216, he repeated, his gaze unwavering. "I believe there's been a complication with my reservation." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. Mrs. Petrov, still shaken, shrank back in her chair, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at the man. I forced myself to meet his gaze, trying to project an air of professionalism I was far from feeling. "Sir," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "I apologize for any inconvenience. There was a system error. The reservation for room 216 was unexpectedly cancelled." He tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "A system error?" he echoed, his voice smooth, almost musical. "How unfortunate." "Yes, sir," I stammered. "I've tried to rectify the issue, but the system seems to be malfunctioning. I can offer you another suite, of course. We have several available, including some of our penthouse VIP rooms." I reached for a keycard, my hand shaking slightly. He watched my every move, his eyes following me with an unnerving intensity. I fumbled with the keycards, dropping one on the counter. He picked it up, his fingers brushing against mine. His touch was surprisingly cold, like touching ice. He looked down at the keycard I offered him, his fingers tightening just slightly around it. "I don't want another room," he said, his voice dropping, becoming deeper, more resonant. "But sir," I protested, trying to maintain my composure. "Room 216 is unavailable. Due to the system error, it's unavailable," he interrupted, his smile tightening. "You don't understand." His words sent a chill down my spine. I tried to explain the situation further, to assure him that I would do everything I could to resolve the issue, but he cut me off again. "No," he said, his voice now laced with a hint of steel. "You don't understand." As he spoke, the temperature in the lobby plummeted. I felt a sudden chill, despite the warm air circulating through the hotel. The marble countertop beneath his hand cracked, a thin line snaking its way across the polished surface. Chunks of marble crumbled like brittle plaster. I stared at the damage, my heart pounding in my chest. The man's grip on the counter hadn't seemed particularly strong, yet he had somehow managed to damage the solid marble. Fear, raw and primal, began to grip me. He looked at me, his perfect face still smiling, But his eyes were too dark, too intense. They seemed to bore into me, to see through me, to know my deepest fears. "No," he repeated, his voice low and menacing. "You don't understand." And then, the lobby phones began to ring. Every single one. At once. The sudden cacophony of ringing phones shattered the silence of the lobby, creating a chaotic, jarring symphony of noise. I jumped, startled, and reached for the nearest phone. I lifted the receiver to my ear, expecting to hear the voice of a guest, or perhaps the night manager calling down from his office. But there was no voice, only static. A deafening, buzzing static that filled my ear, punctuated by distant, distorted screams. Screams of pain, of terror, of unimaginable suffering. I recoiled, dropping the phone as if it had burned me. The ringing continued, a relentless assault on my senses. The screams echoed in my mind, growing louder, more distinct. I could hear the terror in them, the desperation. It was as if the very walls of the hotel were screaming. Then the lights flickered violently, plunging the lobby into darkness. The ringing of the phones abruptly stopped, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. The screams, however, continued, echoing in the darkness, seeming to emanate from the very fabric of the building. The emergency lights kicked in, casting a dim, eerie glow over the lobby. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest. Mrs. Petrov was gone, vanished, and the man, he was gone too. A wave of icy dread washed over me. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that something terrible was happening. Something that defied explanation, something that was beyond my understanding. I stumbled back towards the front desk, my legs trembling. I needed to get out of there. I needed to escape. But as I turned to run, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The elevator doors, which had been closed just moments before, were now open, and standing in the doorway, bathed in the dim light of the emergency exit sign, was the man. He was smiling, a slow, predatory smile that sent shivers down my spine. He raised his hand, beckoning me towards him. "Come," he whispered, his voice like silk. "It's time you understood." I wanted to scream, to run, to hide, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. His eyes held me captive, their dark intensity drawing me in like a moth to a flame. I took a hesitant step towards him, then another. My body moved against my will, as if I was being pulled by an invisible force. I couldn't explain it. I just knew that I had to go to him. I had to know what he wanted. As I approached the elevator, the screams grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the upper floors of the hotel, a chorus of terror echoing through the corridors. The man smiled, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "They're waiting for you," he whispered. He gestured towards the elevator. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The doors closed behind me, and the elevator began to ascend. As I rose, I could hear the screams growing louder, closer. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I was heading towards something terrible, something that would change my life forever. Something that would reveal the true secrets of the Grand Azure Hotel. The elevator ascended slowly, each floor clicking by like a death knell. The screams grew louder, more distinct, no longer a distant chorus but individual cries of agony. They clawed at my sanity, each one a shard of ice piercing my heart. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing I could block out the horrifying symphony of suffering. But the screams were inside my head now, a chorus of despair echoing in the hollow spaces of my mind. The elevator doors opened on the second floor. The hallway was dimly lit, the emergency lights casting long, distorted shadows that danced on the walls. The air was thick with a stench so foul it made my stomach churn. It was a combination of decay, blood, and something else. Something acrid and unnatural, like burnt sulfur. I stepped out of the elevator, my legs trembling. The stench was overpowering, making it difficult to breathe. I covered my nose with my hand, trying to filter out the nauseating odor. The screams were deafening now, coming from all directions. They were close, too close. I walked down the hallway, drawn by an invisible force. The door to room 216 was slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness peeked through the opening, promising unimaginable horrors. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The rule "never enter" echoed in my mind. But the screams, they were pulling me in, beckoning me towards the darkness. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was a charnel house. Rotting corpses were scattered everywhere. Some slumped against the walls, others sprawled on the floor in grotesque positions. The air was thick with the stench of death, a suffocating blanket of decay. I gagged, my stomach churning violently. One man, still alive, sat strapped to a chair in the center of the room. His lips were sewn shut with thick black thread, his eyes wide with terror. He shook violently, trying to scream, but only a muffled whimper escaped his lips. His gaze was fixed on something behind me, something I couldn't see. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Handwritten contracts, stained with blood and grime, were nailed to the walls with rusty knives. Each contract bore a name, a promise, and a price. A deal made with the devil. And then I saw it. A new contract. It was lying on a small table near the window. My name was written on it in elegant script. Juliana. The space for my signature was blank. A wave of nausea washed over me. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth. This couldn't be real. This had to be a nightmare. Suddenly the door slammed shut behind me. I whirled around, grabbing at the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. And then I felt a hand on my wrist. A cold, clammy hand that gripped me with surprising strength. I gasped, turning to face my captor. It was the man from the lobby. He stood behind me, his smile now gone, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating light. "Welcome, Juliana," he said, his voice smooth, almost seductive. "I've been expecting you." I tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong. Who are you?" I stammered, my voice trembling. He chuckled, a low, menacing sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You know who I am," he said. "You felt my presence in the lobby. You heard the screams. You saw what's in this room." "No," I whispered, shaking my head in denial. This can't be happening." "It is happening, Juliana," he said, his voice hardening. "And you're now a part of it." He gestured towards the contracts on the wall. "These are my agreements," he explained. "Deals made with desperate souls. They come to me seeking power, wealth, success. And I grant their wishes. But there's always a price." "And what's the price?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Their souls," he replied, his eyes gleaming. "They belong to me. And this room is where they pay their dues." He looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the decaying corpses. "They failed to uphold their end of the bargain," he said. "They broke their promises, and now they suffer." He turned back to me, his eyes locking on mine. "You erased me from the system, Juliana," he said. "That means you control where I stay." He held out the contract, the one with my name on it. "You give me back my room," he said, "and I'll put everything back." "Put what back?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Everything," he replied. "The hotel will return to normal. The bodies, the blood, the screams, all gone. The guests will wake up, the horror will disappear. It will be as if nothing ever happened." "And what do I get in return?" I asked, my mind racing. "You get to keep your job," he said with a smirk. "You get to keep your comfortable life. And you get to be a part of something bigger than yourself." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You see, Juliana," he continued, "I need someone to manage this room, someone to make sure it remains reserved, someone to find new clients." He held out the contract again. "You have a choice," he said. "Sign this contract and become my partner. Help me run my business. Or refuse, and watch this hotel become hell itself." The screams echoed around me, a chorus of torment. I looked at the contract, my name staring back at me. The choice was clear. A deal with the devil. My soul for the salvation of the Grand Azure. But as I reached for the pen, a thought occurred to me. If I was going to make a deal with the devil, I was going to do it on my terms. "I'll sign," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "But I have some conditions." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Conditions?" "Yes," I said. "I want a higher salary, a significant increase, and I want a guarantee. No innocent people will be harmed, only those who deserve it, those who have committed truly heinous acts." He considered my demands for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "And who decides who deserves it?" he asked. "I do," I replied. "I choose who you target, and I get final approval on every contract." He smiled, a slow, predatory smile. "You're a tough negotiator, Juliana," he said. "I like that." He extended his hand. "Deal?" I looked at the contract one last time, my heart pounding in my chest. I was making a deal with the devil, but I was doing it for the right reasons, wasn't I? I took his hand. "Deal," I said. His grip was cold, a stark contrast to the clammy sweat that slicked my own palm. As our hands clasped, a jolt of energy, raw and electric, surged through me. It wasn't painful, but it was unnerving. Like static electricity, it made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The air in the room crackled, the stench of decay momentarily receding, replaced by a strange, almost metallic scent. He released my hand, the coldness lingering on my skin. He picked up the pen from the table and offered it to me. "Sign," he said, his voice regaining its smooth, seductive quality. I took the pen, my fingers trembling slightly. I glanced at the contract, my name emblazoned at the top. Below, the terms of our agreement were laid out in chillingly precise detail. The increased salary, the guarantee of no innocent blood, my right to choose the targets, all were there, exactly as I had demanded. He hadn't tried to bargain, hadn't attempted to weasel out of my conditions. It was as if he had expected them, as if he had known I would ask for them. I hesitated for a moment, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. This was it, the point of no return. Once I signed, I would be bound to him, a partner in his dark enterprise. But the image of the rotting corpses, the man with his lips sewn shut, the screams echoing through the hotel, they spurred me on. This was the only way to undo the horror, to restore some semblance of order to the Grand Azure. I signed. The moment the pen touched the paper, a wave of warmth washed over me, a stark contrast to the chill that had permeated the room. The metallic scent intensified, then faded, replaced by the familiar, if still nauseating, stench of decay. But it was less overpowering, as if the room itself was settling, calming down. He took the contract from me, his eyes scanning the signature. A flicker of satisfaction crossed his face. "Excellent," he said. "Now let's get to work." He clapped his hands and the room began to change. The corpses vanished, one by one, dissolving into dust that swirled away like smoke. The blood stains on the walls faded, leaving the wallpaper pristine. The man strapped to the chair slumped forward, his head lolling to the side. His lips were still sewn shut, but the terror in his eyes was gone, replaced by a blank, vacant stare. The stench of decay receded further, until it was barely noticeable. The screams quieted, becoming a distant murmur, like the echo of a nightmare fading with the dawn. The room was returning to normal, or at least to a semblance of normalcy. The horror was being swept under the rug, hidden away from the eyes of the unsuspecting guests. "Now," he said, turning to me, "about my room." He gestured towards the door. "You know what to do." I nodded, my mind already working. I walked over to the phone on the small table and dialed the front desk. "This is Juliana," I said, my voice calm and professional. "I need to reinstate the reservation for room 216. It was cancelled in error." "Certainly, Miss Juliana," the night clerk replied. "I'll take care of it immediately." "Thank you," I said, "and make sure it's marked as permanently reserved. No exceptions." "Yes, Miss Juliana," the clerk said. "I understand." I hung up the phone and turned back to him. "It's done," I said. "Room 216 is yours." He smiled, a genuine smile this time, though it still held a hint of something predatory. "Good," he said. "You're a quick learner, Juliana. I have a feeling we're going to work well together." He walked towards the door, then paused, turning back to me. "There's one more thing," he said. "About the clients." "I know," I said. "I'll find them for you, but remember our agreement. Only those who deserve it, and I get final approval." He nodded. "Of course," he said. "I trust your judgment." He opened the door and stepped out, disappearing into the hallway. I was left alone in the room, the silence broken only by the distant hum of the hotel's ventilation system. The stench of decay was almost gone, the screams reduced to a faint whisper. But they were still there, a constant reminder of the horror that lay hidden beneath the surface of the Grand Azure. I walked over to the window and looked out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. Everything looked normal, peaceful. But I knew the truth. I knew what lurked behind the closed doors of room 216. I knew the price of the Grand Azure's success. Time passed. Weeks turned into months. The Grand Azure thrived, its reputation for luxury and impeccable service untarnished. I, Juliana, became a fixture at the front desk, my demeanor calm and professional, my smile polite and welcoming. I was good at my job. Too good. I was well compensated, living a life of comfort and luxury. I had moved out of my cramped apartment and into a spacious penthouse overlooking the city. I bought expensive clothes, dined at the finest restaurants, and traveled to exotic destinations. I had everything I had ever wanted. But the weight of my secret was a constant burden. I lived with the knowledge of what happened in room 216, the screams echoing in the back of my mind. I saw the man from the lobby occasionally, a fleeting glimpse in the hallway, a nod across the lobby. He never spoke to me directly, but I knew he was watching me, observing my every move, and I was observing him. I studied the contracts, learning the names, the faces, the crimes. I researched their lives, digging into their pasts, confirming their guilt. I became a judge, a jury, and an executioner, all rolled into one. I justified my actions by telling myself I was doing what was necessary. These were bad people, I reasoned. They deserved what was coming to them. I was simply delivering justice, albeit a dark, twisted form of justice. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. I was complicit in the evil, a partner in the devil's enterprise. I had made a deal with the devil, and now I was paying the price. My soul, slowly but surely, was being consumed by the darkness. The clicking of the keyboard was a rhythmic counterpoint to the hushed elegance of the Grand Azure lobby. Another late night, another string of impeccably dressed guests checking in, their faces etched with the weariness of travel or the anticipation of illicit rendezvous. I, Juliana, the ever-present, ever-composed front desk clerk, greeted each one with a practiced smile, my movements precise and efficient. Years had passed since that first terrifying night, years since I made the deal, and the Grand Azure, under my watchful eye, had become a monument to deceptive tranquility. The polished mahogany of the front desk felt familiar beneath my fingertips, the cool smoothness a constant reminder of the bargain I had struck. Luxury surrounded me, the soft murmur of the water feature, the gentle scent of exotic orchids, the hushed conversations of the late-night patrons in the adjacent bar. It was a world away from the fear and chaos of that first night, a world meticulously crafted to conceal the darkness that pulsed just beneath the surface. I glanced at the reservation system on my computer screen. Room 216 was, as always, marked as permanently reserved. It was his room, his domain, and I, Juliana, was his gatekeeper. The man from the lobby, the one whose name I still didn't know, though I suspected I did, appeared occasionally. A fleeting glimpse in the hallway, a nod across the lobby, a shared, knowing glance. He never spoke to me directly, but his presence was a constant reminder of the deal we had made. He didn't need to. The screams in the back of my mind were reminder enough. I had become adept at my task. I knew how to find them, the ones who deserved it. I delved into the dark corners of the internet, sifting through police reports, news articles, online forums. I became an expert in human depravity, recognizing the subtle signs of corruption, the telltale whispers of evil. I learned to distinguish between the truly wicked and those merely misguided, those who had simply made bad choices. My criteria were stringent. No innocent blood, that was the cornerstone of our agreement. And I was thorough. I verified every detail, double-checking, triple-checking, ensuring that the targets were truly deserving of the fate that awaited them in room 216. I told myself it was about justice, about balancing the scales. But deep down, I knew it was about something else. It was about control. It was about power. It was about the chilling satisfaction of knowing that I, Juliana, had the power to decide who lived and who died. The weight of my actions was a constant companion. It settled in the pit of my stomach, a cold, heavy stone that never left. I tried to ignore it, to push it away, but it was always there, a dark shadow lurking at the edge of my consciousness. I had become a master of compartmentalization. I could switch between Juliana, the polite, professional front desk clerk, and Juliana, the judge, the jury, the executioner, with chilling ease. I could smile and chat with a guest, recommending local restaurants and tourist attractions while simultaneously planning the downfall of another. The irony wasn't lost on me. I, who had once been so desperate to escape my own difficult life, had become the architect of other people's nightmares. I had traded my soul for comfort, for security, for a life of luxury. And in doing so, I had become something I never thought I could be. I had become a monster. The late-night shift was always the quietest. Most of the guests were tucked away in their rooms, sleeping or engaging in whatever clandestine activities they had come to the Grand Azure for. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the occasional distant murmur of conversation from the bar. Tonight, however, there was a different kind of quiet, a stillness that felt charged, as if the very air was holding its breath. I glanced at the computer screen. Room 216 was, as always, marked as reserved. But tonight there was a new name attached to it. A name I recognized. A name that made my blood run cold. He was here. I had been expecting him. I had known deep down that he would come. He was different from the others. He wasn't a petty criminal, a corrupt businessman, or a predator hiding in the shadows. He was something far worse. He was pure evil, cloaked in the guise of respectability. He had power, influence, connections. He was untouchable, or so he thought. I had spent weeks researching him, digging into his past, uncovering the dark secrets he had so carefully concealed. I had found the evidence, the undeniable proof of his depravity. He was a monster, a wolf in sheep's clothing, and tonight, he would pay the price. The elevator doors chimed open, and he stepped out. He was tall, impeccably dressed, his face handsome, almost too handsome. He exuded an air of power and confidence, the kind that came from knowing you could get away with anything. He walked towards the front desk, his footsteps silent on the marble floor. He stopped in front of me, his eyes meeting mine. He didn't smile. "Room 216, he said, his voice smooth, confident. "Of course, miss." I paused, letting the unspoken question hang in the air. He gave me a knowing look. "You know who I am, Juliana," he said. I met his gaze, my own expression unwavering. "Yes," I replied. "I do." I reached for the keycard, my hand steady. I didn't offer him a different room. I didn't apologize for any system errors. I simply handed him the keycard. He took it, his fingers brushing against mine. His touch was cold as always. But tonight I didn't flinch. "Thank you, Juliana," he said. "You're welcome," I replied. He turned and walked towards the elevator. As he did, I noticed a slight tremor in his hand as he inserted the keycard, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He stepped into the elevator, and the doors closed behind him. I watched as the elevator ascended, carrying him to the second floor. I knew what awaited him there. I had made sure of it. I had prepared the room, laying out the contracts, arranging the accommodations. Tonight, the hunter would become the hunted. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. I could hear the screams now, echoing in my mind. But tonight, they weren't screams of terror, they were screams of justice. Or at least, that's what I told myself. I opened my eyes and looked at the computer screen. Room 216 was still marked as reserved, but soon it would be available again. And I would be ready. I would be waiting. For the next guest. For the next target. For the next soul to be claimed. The Grand Azure shimmered, its lights reflecting in the polished marble floor. It was a beautiful hotel, a perfect hotel. A hotel with a dark secret, and I, Juliana, was its keeper.